Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. I'm here with the one and only Thom Hartmann. He's back with us again. And you know what, folks? He has another book out, and it's called The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. Welcome aboard, Thom. How are you doing today?
Hey, Egberto, it's great to see you. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on your program.
Well, talking about honor, the honor is always mine. You know, I've been following you for years now, for a long time, from coffee party days and all the other times. But I tell you, Thom, when you wrote this book and I read this book and I picked it up, it was like, this was right down the alley of a lot of the stuff that we talk about, from monopolies to unfettered capitalism to the whole works. And I like the angle that you take. I wasn't able to read the book in details, but I scanned it right through real fast and said, oh my God, it's right there. I want to ask you to explain something to the American people because I think they don't quite understand this. Before we can get into basics, what is a corporation?
A corporation is a legal fiction that provides a structure or a framework within which people can legally conduct business in the United States or anywhere in the world. I mean, corporations are the modern corporation was started in 1601, in December of 1601, when Queen Elizabeth I chartered the East India Company. And, it's gone through a lot of tweaks in the years since then, but it's really only a 400-year-old institution. And in its modern form in the United States, arguably only about 200 years old.
Now, isn't it true that corporations in the past, they came into existence for a certain thing and then they went out of existence?
Yeah. In fact, up until the 1890s, most states required corporations to, essentially shut their doors after 20, 30, or 40 years. 40 years was the most common. But there was a limited lifespan. Now, the corporation could roll over. They could close their doors, and then an hour later, all the assets be picked up by a brand new corporation of the same name. But it was basically a corporate governance oversight kind of thing. The secretaries of state in all the states, up until the 1890s, were required every year or every 2 years, depending on the state, to examine the books of every corporation that's doing business in the state and to determine whether they were complying with what every state required the first sentence of articles of incorporation to be, or the statement of purpose in the articles of incorporation, which was this corporation is incorporated to benefit the people of the state of blank by fill in the blank, manufacturing railroad cars or whatever it may be. So the first purpose of a corporation up until the 1890s in the United States was to benefit the people. And the secretaries of state had to evaluate the corporations on an annual or biannual basis on that criteria. And if the corporation failed, they got the corporate death penalty. It happened to a couple thousand corporations a year across the U.S. until the 1890s.
Well, you talk about the death penalty, I think, as part of a solution at the end. So let's go ahead and kind of put that at the end. But I tell you one thing. The reason I wanted you to do that is because people look at corporations as some abstract thing, and it's almost now like a cliche. And I want to take it away from being a cliche, and that's why I love what you're doing with your book and your series. I want to take these things away from being a cliche that, let's say, the right can use as, oh, that's just how those wacko guys at the left think, and put it into something meaningful to people. Now, large corporations, for all practical purposes, have turned into exactly what your book talks about, which is monopolies. Right. How did that happen? And give us the story.
Well, if you think of it in terms of biology, we all have bodies, and our bodies are relatively homeostatic in biological balance. And, your kidneys don't demand more of your body than your liver, inappropriately, for example. But if a single cell in the body, and it always starts with one cell, if a single cell in the body decides that it's going to reproduce, to infinity, and it's going to start sucking down the resources, it's going to start aggressively competing with every other cell in the body rather than cooperating, that will happen, and that cell will grow, that cell will turn into a cell mass, and it will develop its own vascular system, and it'll reroute all the blood and nutrients in the body to itself. And, in the process, the person will shrink up and wither away. And we call that cancer. Um, Similarly, in the business world, when a corporation, in the context of the larger ecosystem of corporations, of businesses, decides that it's going to suck up all the resources, it's going to suck up all the customers, it's going to suck up all the money, it's going to prevent other companies from being able to successfully compete. When that happens, I think that it's entirely appropriate to call that cancer too. But instead, we call that monopoly, or what's more common in America actually is oligopoly, which is where you have a handful of corporations dominating a sector or an industry. 3, 4 airlines, 3 or 4, 5 networks, in television or radio. 5 food companies, 3 restaurant chains, etc. These aren't true monopolies; they're oligopolies, but they're functionally the same thing. So I put them under the umbrella of monopoly. But it's cancer. And back in the 1880s, realizing that this was cancer, our government, with the help of Senator Sherman from Ohio, passed a law that was designed to be the immune system. I mean, we have cells in our bodies that become cancerous literally all the time, apparently every day. And we have an immune system that recognizes those individual rogue cancer cells flying around and attacks them and kills them. And you have to have the same thing in capitalism. And so the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was an anti-monopoly law, was designed to be the immune system for capitalism. And it worked pretty well, along with its children, the Clayton Act and the Antitrust Act of I think it was 1954. And they kept corporations to a reasonable extent in check.
How did they do that?
Until the 80s. Well, basically what they said was, if for example, in the 1930s, I think it was, Buster Brown was a shoe company, and Thom McAn was a shoe company. I remember that well because I adopted their spelling for my name, Thom, when I was like 8 years old, because it was partly that. It was partly that's how Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Edison would occasionally spell it. And none of these companies had more than 3 or 4% of the total marketplace. But Buster Brown wanted to buy another company. I don't think it was Thom McAn, but it was another one of the shoe companies in the United States. And the regulatory agency, the federal agency that oversaw that, which had a different name at the time, but today we'd call it the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Justice Department, or both. Said you can't merge because as a combined company you'll have more than 5 or 6% of the total shoe market, and that is moving in the direction of monopoly. In the 1880s, what happened was Ohio had passed their version of the Sherman Act a few years before the federal version, and no coincidence that Senator Sherman came out of Ohio. And people I don't think anybody's alive today that's old enough to remember, but back in the 1880s, 1890s, the 2 largest oil producing states were Ohio and Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And thus Pennzoil, and thus Standard Oil of Ohio. And all those wells have been largely pumped dry now, and in fact were by the 1940s. But that's where the action was. And so John Rockefeller set up Standard Oil in Ohio and basically reached out to all his competitors and said, instead of my having to put you out of business, I'll let you buy into my company by giving me your company, and I'll give you some stock in this larger company in exchange for that, which wasn't a terrible deal. And he ended up, although many of his practices were just downright evil, but nonetheless, he ended up controlling nearly, as I recall, 97%, it's in the book, of the entire oil business in multiple states, particularly Ohio and Pennsylvania. And so the Ohio Attorney General's office said to him, if you do this, if you continue to do this, we're going to give you 1 year to stop. And if you continue to do this, we're going to put you in prison, because it was a criminal violation. So in the 1890s, Rockefeller reached out rather publicly, and said, if any state is willing to change their corporation laws to allow what I'm doing to be legal, I will move my operations to that state. I'll bring hundreds of employees with me and millions of dollars. And that kicked off a massive competition on the East Coast between New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Delaware. New Jersey ended up getting his business. Delaware ended up with the most lax corporate laws, which is why more than half of all the companies in the New York Stock Exchange today are Delaware corporations.
Credit card companies inclusive.
Yeah, although the credit card companies did something that's kind of slick. They got Nixon to pass a law saying that banks could operate across state lines. Prior to that, it was illegal, and that's why Wells Fargo was just a California company, and Bank of America was just a New York company. So first of all, you got to allow them to do their business across state lines, and then the banks reached out to states around the United States and said, we will move all of our credit card operations to whatever state gives us the loosest regulatory environment. And North Dakota did that. They said, basically, you can do anything. And back at that time, in fact, it was illegal to charge more than 12% interest. There were usury laws. But North Dakota said, you can charge whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, you can screw your customers, we don't care, bring it all to North Dakota. And that's why if you pull your credit card out of your pocket right now, you'll see that it's typically at the bottom of the fine print, it says a North Dakota corporation.
Right.
And this is why the health insurance companies right now, and Donald Trump, are trying to say, we need to have the ability of health insurance companies to sell across state lines so that they can then just, basically bribe one state legislature, to crash the laws, and then they'll move all to that state, and then we'll all be screwed with regard to health insurance.
Now, Thom, what you just said there is something important, because you'll hear Republicans throw that out quite often, and Americans don't quite understand what it means. So that statement that you just made there, we've got to frame to let people understand exactly what's going on.
It is a big deal. It's why these credit card companies can screw you, and Trump and the Republicans.
Absolutely, it's huge. But people just say it, right? They just go out there and say, "Oh, we need to allow when they're itemizing how to make healthcare better or whatever better. We just need to go ahead and allow them to shop around states." No, that point that you made is very important. Now, let's kind of dial back a bit, because early in your book you talk about patents and copyrights under monopolies. Tell me exactly
something you have some experience with.
Yes. Tell me, give me what you think about. Give me your spill on that, if you will.
Well, I agree with Jefferson. Jefferson actually had worked for 6 months or so as a patent clerk when he was young, when he was learning to be a lawyer. And he had some very, very strong opinions on this. He invented several hundred inventions during his life, and he refused to patent any of them, as did his friend Ben Franklin, who invented bifocals and the Franklin stove, and had something like 400 major consequential inventions. And they both felt that when you invent something, you, by definition, are standing on the shoulders of somebody who invented the thing that you invented this out of. And therefore, it should be offered for the benefit of society. On the other hand, Jefferson acknowledged that you want to encourage people to invent things. And that's why the Constitution explicitly says in Article 1, Section 8, that Congress may pass laws protecting copyrights, patents, and trademarks in order to advance the useful arts and sciences, is the phrase in the Constitution. So we want to give people an incentive. So Jefferson thought, well, 3 years should be enough. In 3 years, you can make money off your invention, but we really want these inventions to roll back into the public as quickly as possible so that the next inventor will build on top of that last invention. And in fact, that was, I don't know exactly when the laws changed. I believe it's in the book. It's kind of, minute detail stuff. But over 240 years, we went
to 17 years. Yeah.
Yeah. It's much even longer than that in some cases now, with the ability to renew them and all this kind of stuff. And with trademarks, the mouse, Disney just made it crazy, which is in the book.
Right. It is crazy because, like I said, when it comes to these issues, and I think you brought it up fine. We are all built. We all develop based on what other people's work. So how comes we can just go ahead and be the person holding that patent? Now, you said that the founders were inherently anti-monopolistic. How true is? Kind of give
That's
me.
Very true.
Okay.
Virtually, if you look at the state constitutional conventions, more than half of the people who showed up to ratify the Constitution were farmers, teachers, or people who were in debt. You know, people talk about the oligarchs at the founding, or even the people who were at the Constitutional Convention. It wasn't until 1891, I believe it was, that America had its first person who was worth $1 million in today's dollars. And $1 million in today's dollars will buy you a nice house in downtown Portland, Oregon. You know, not even a fancy house. Jefferson died bankrupt. Washington died close to bankrupt. The richest man who signed the Constitution was John Hancock, and his net worth was about $700,000 in today's money. So these guys were, you know, the upper middle class basically, and most of them were running their own little ventures. You know, whether it was plantations. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of problems with that. And the way it was done back then, you know, with slavery and everything else. But whether it was plantations or whether it was, you know, Washington made nails for horseshoes, and I think he made horseshoes as well. He was making steel pipe. I mean, they were basically running small businesses. Virtually all of them. There were the only large corporation in America at the founding of this republic was the British East India Company, and the American Revolution was triggered in 1773 by the Boston Tea Party, which was an open revolt against.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your book. Yeah.
Monopoly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, there was a very strong anti-monopoly sentiment, which kind of went to hell in the South, starting in the 1820s with John C. Calhoun. And as a result, largely of the invention of cotton gin. That's kind of a digression, though. That's not in this book. That's all in the book that I just finished writing, which will be out in the spring, The Hidden History of Tyranny and Oligarchy in America.
Oh, wow. Oh, that is a great continuation to this.
Yeah. It's sort of the back. It's the book end of this book. This book is about monopoly in commerce, and the next book is about monopoly in political power.
Well, let me, since you said it that way, let me go ahead and say, give me the relationship between monopolies and the fermentation of, or how it affects the middle class.
Well, monopolies, you know, are inherently anti-middle class because the goal of them, you know, once a business has achieved oligopoly or monopoly status, they no longer have to worry about their workers. People who have a particular skill set that's unique to that industry, you know, whether it's flight attendants or whether it's, you know, electricians or whatever it may be. If they, in a non-monopolized environment, they can always go to another employer. But in a highly monopolized environment, they really don't have that option. And so as a result of that, as monopoly has grown in the United States since basically the early 1980s, when Reagan just functionally stopped enforcing the anti-monopoly laws.
I want to touch on that in a special way because you hit it a special way in your book where you state Reaganomics ensured American leisure for the few. And here's where I would like to tie that into, Thom. Right now, you know, the $600 that we are given to the average American citizen who's unemployed.
We're getting.
Actually, yes, we're getting. One of the pretexts was that they're getting too much. It's going to stop them from working, and all they want to bring all these issues up, right? When the reality is that those that are on top of them, I think, are doing quite well. Much more so, and maybe, just maybe, that 40 hours at $15 an hour for a week may just help the economy as it did.
Yeah. Well, it raises the question, if conservatives and Republicans are so concerned that we're going to destroy the work ethic and thus destroy the American economy by giving people $600 a week, why the hell do they want Paris Hilton to get millions of dollars in inheritance? I mean, do they really hate her?
Wow. Yes, exactly. Right.
You know, why do they want CEO salaries to go from the $100,000 to $200,000 a year that they were averaging in today's money back in 1960 to $30 or $40 million a year? Why should somebody earn, you know, $1 million every 2 weeks in their paycheck if $600 a week is enough to destroy a person's incentive to work?
When did I miss that on your show, Thom?
It's
When
crazy.
did I miss that one? I mean, that's actually the excellent analogy,
Yeah,
right? Because
yeah.
what do they
Just
call
the
that?
hypocrisy of their argument.
Yes. When did I miss that show? I mean, that is actually the best analogy there are, because you're talking about an even greater delta. So I mean,
Yeah.
what do they call it? That's a hell of a moral hazard, right?
Yeah, they must hate the Walton family, you know.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, I like. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Reaganomics, and so explain to America, because Reagan still has a godly stance with even some progressives. I'm here in Texas, and you have some progressives still think fondly of his policies, and they actually think they were benevolent. Kind of express in a lot of the ways that you do how that was almost the Powell Manifesto on steroids.
Yeah. Well, it was, and it grew out of the Powell Manifesto, actually, the Powell Memo of 1971, and two Supreme Court decisions in 1976 and 78,
Mm-hmm.
Buckley versus Vallejo and First National Bank versus Bellotti, which legalized political bribery, and that brought a flood of cash into the Reagan campaign in '79 and put him into office in 1980 or '81. But basically, historically, we had always understood. I mean, go back and read Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations,
Mm-hmm.
1776, or any of the classic, economists. We understood that what drives an economy is something called demand. People
Mm-hmm.
want, they have the resources to buy something, and then the people who are producing those somethings get to compete for the customer, and hopefully in a non-monopolized world. And Reagan flipped that upside down. He said and economists use the phrase aggregate demand, which is
Aggregate demand, yeah.
right, which is econ speak for wages. That's
Mm-hmm.
all, and all it means is wages. So that's what drives an economy. Well, Reagan came along and said, no, that's not what drives an economy. We have a new idea. It was a crazy idea. George Herbert Walker Bush called it voodoo economics
Yes, he did.
until he was picked as VP. But we've got this new idea, and this new idea is that demand doesn't drive an economy, supply drives an economy. And there are examples where supply actually does stimulate economy. For example, when Steve Jobs invented the iPhone,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly people wanted to have one. Or when they invented the Mac, he and Steve Wozniak, oh yeah, we want to have one. But those are really the exceptions that prove the rule. The
But
fact
Tom, let me break you right there, because I don't even know if I accept that, right? Because they invented something that was good, and then the demand for that something good came, and then they provided a supply for it.
Exactly. Well, that was my next sentence. Was it had workers not had wages that allowed them to buy
Right.
those products, they would have just faded away
Right.
into oblivion. So, but Reagan said, we're not going to pay attention to wages anymore. That's irrelevant. We are simply going to pay attention to producers, to the manufacturers, to the makers, not the takers, to use the libertarian language.
You had to bring that one in.
Sorry, Ayn Rand 101. And it's been a disaster. I mean, it's just been an absolute disaster from the 1800s, from the mid 1800s until 1980. They were keeping track of productivity and wages, and productivity and wages always tracked each other, because
Mm-hmm.
factories wanted, as employees became more productive, largely as a result of automation, the Industrial Revolution, but as employees became more productive, they actually wanted those employees to have more of the fruit of that productivity, because those employees would be customers. Henry Ford rationalized, more than doubling his wages, in one day, because he wanted his employees to be able to buy his cars, or at least he said so. I realize there's more to the story than
Mm-hmm.
that, but there's truth to the myth.
Yes.
And Reagan said that's irrelevant. That doesn't matter. And so what happened was, in 1980, that rise of wages came to a screeching halt and has not increased in 40 years since then. But productivity continued to increase, which produced a spread.
A delta, yeah.
Which was, a delta, which was profit. And all
Right.
that profit that used to go to wages and used to drive and build the middle class instead went to the owner class, the stockholders and the CEOs and the people who owned the corporations. And that's why you've got, 12 people worth 12 Americans worth $1 trillion now. You've got 3 Americans who own more wealth in the bottom half of Americans. It's all the result of Reaganomics and the structural changes, the elimination of enforcement of anti-monopoly laws, a big piece of it, dropping the top corporate and individual tax rate. The individual tax rate was 74%, dropping it down to 28% and keeping it low. These are the things that have destroyed the middle class. And we're still, and people think, oh, Reagan, that was 40 years ago. We are still operating in a Reaganomics environment. Obama never reversed this and Clinton never reversed this. Frankly, I don't think either of them had the political power to do so. But I think now Americans are realizing that Reaganomics was a lie and a scam, and it has devastated the American worker and the American middle class and working class.
I have a question for you.
And locked out small businesses.
I have a question for you because, Clinton didn't have the power to do it. Let me ask you this, what you think about Obama here. Do you remember Obama for America? Do you remember how powerful and sort of within every sphere that organization was? I don't know if you were.
No, I know it was all over the place, but
right.
The fact of the matter is that Obama only had a veto proof for a
few months
Senate for 74 business days. That was it in his entire 8 years.
And I don't think the Democrats that he had would have gone with him. But
he had people like Joe Lieberman,
right,
who killed the public option.
My big concern, however, was why not mobilize those people to force those people's hands? But I could be wrong there.
I think that's going to happen. I really do. It's Bernie Sanders the other day said, if Joe Biden becomes president, he'll be the most progressive president since Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah, he said that yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was immediately thinking, what about LBJ, who gave us Medicare and Medicaid and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and right. Dozens of different welfare programs and Title IX and Section 8 and all this stuff. And then I thought, he might. If he gets a Franklin Roosevelt style, or frankly an LBJ style, LBJ had more than 2/3 of the House and Senate, both. If he gets that kind of an overwhelming mandate legislatively, he may well do it.
So are you thinking like me that this may actually be a landslide in November?
Yeah, I barring massive election fraud or World War III that would, bring everything to its knees. And I know that Donald Trump is working on both those things as well.
Yeah, I got my clock clean from some of my viewers today when I said it was going to be a landslide. So that's a feeling that I have.
Well, a lot of us are spooked about jinxing things.
Yeah,
4 years ago.
I don't believe in the jinx. I don't. In fact, 4 years ago, what wasn't a surprise at Daily Kos, I wrote that was a likelihood, and because as it turned out, we were looking at Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania for quite a long time, and quite a few people were talking to her people in Brooklyn. Hey, you got to go into Detroit. You got to go into Pittsburgh. You got to go into Milwaukee.
This is where you call for bringing back the capital punishment for Robbie Mook or something like that. I shouldn't even say stuff like that. I mean, political capital punishment.
I know what Tom, trust me, everybody knows what you mean. But let me ask you this, guys. We're coming close to time, and you came up with some. First of all, folks, you've got to get this book. Tom is not going to tell you everything in this book because you got to go buy it. But here's the thing, Tom. What's that?
Okay, I'll tell you everything.
No, don't tell me everything. It's not a good. But here's the deal. You talk about solutions, and one of the things that we don't get in solutions, a lot of these books come out and they tell you stories, right? And what I like about your books is you come out and say, hey, we can do these 5 things or these 6 things. Kind of enumerate those things for me if you don't mind.
Geez, it's been a while since I read my own book.
Okay, well, no, you don't have to get your book. You don't have to get the book, because I tell you what, I have it right here, and then you can tell me exactly what you mean.
Okay.
Democracy immune system, and you described that earlier on.
Right, that's the antitrust laws.
That's the antitrust laws. Then we have the replace a consumer welfare framework.
Now Robert Bork is the guy. He was the intellectual giant, as it were. He certainly thought he was a giant. His book is filled with him praising himself and talking about how wonderful and smart he is. Seriously, honest to God, it's embarrassing to read. But Robert Bork came up with this idea in the late 60s, early 70s, after he was a student of Milton Friedman's at the Chicago School of Economics, that historically we measured we decided that corporations had multiple constituencies. They had the constituency of their employees, to whom they were responsible, of their community to which they were responsible, of their customers to whom they were responsible, the institution of the corporation itself to which they were responsible, and the environment and things like that. I mean, there were multiple shareholders essentially, and Robert and our corporate laws all reflected that. Robert Bork came along and said, that's all nonsense. Throw all that stuff out, even though it's been around for hundreds of years. Throw it out. It's BS. The only metric that we should measure a corporation by, in terms of whether it is a monopoly or not, or a destructive monopoly or not, he was not opposed to monopoly. He was opposed to destructive monopolies, is if they have caused consumer prices to increase. If they cause consumer prices to increase, break them up. If they don't. And thus we got Walmart and we got the airlines and we got everything else. And in fact, actually, they are raising prices. I opened the book with the story that the average American middle-class family is paying
internet, $90.
$5,000 a year as a monopoly tax.
Yeah.
$90 for internet when it's $25, $30 in most of Europe.
Yeah. It's crazy.
And it's faster and better.
I'm from Central America, Panama. And when I went home, I was shocked that my internet in Panama City was faster than my internet in Kingwood, Texas.
Yep.
Amazing.
Probably cheaper.
Much cheaper. They can't afford anything expensive over there.
Yeah.
Okay, now so you talk about breaking up the internet giants. That's self-explicative. Bring back the corporate death penalty. A lot of people don't know what that really means.
Well, we talked about this earlier. It's where a corporation is determined to be acting in something other than the public interest. And so the Secretary of State in the state in which they're incorporated dissolves the corporation. It's a forced bankruptcy, essentially. And people go, oh my God, if you did that to United Airlines. So this is why I don't think we should have bailed out any corporation that's worth more than $1 billion. We shouldn't have given them a penny. And people were like, what? United will go out of business and 20,000 flight attendants will be out of job and, 5,000 pilots. And I'm like, yeah, of course. And the next day, 5 new airlines will start, right?
Exactly.
It will open up all these niches in the airline ecosystem. And that's not just true of the airlines. I mean, pick your industry, hotels, restaurants, whatever it may be. Yes, let them fail. And let small businesses come in behind and reinvigorate the American.
What is a guy like the left, like you, really believing in true competition, which is the other one? You're not supposed to believe in competition, sir.
Well, I believe in fair competition. I don't believe in unfair competition.
I know. I'm just kidding here. I know that. And then a solution is competition, which is what you just said.
Right. And competition is what should drive businesses. And at its heart, if you wanted a single sentence definition of monopoly, a monopoly exists when a corporation or group of corporations have seized such control of an individual market, niche, or sector that they no longer need to compete with each other, that instead they collaborate with each other. If Delta raises their prices $5 within 30 seconds, United has done the same thing. That's not competition.
The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream by Thom Hartmann. Thom, thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right. As usual, you're not only a studied man, you're entertaining in the way you inform and teach. Thank you so kindly for being here.
Thanks, Egberto. It's always a pleasure to be here with you.
I'm Egberto Willies, host of Politics Done Right, an independent news program. I post several news videos of interest every day. I ask you so kindly to subscribe to my channel, and please leave me some comments. Thank you very much.